Hi, I'm Anne and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be discussing the books that I read in September as well as my TBR for October. September was a rather good reading month. I read more books than I thought I would. I believe I read 13. Since I have been using the Storygraph a little bit more than Goodreads, I have been enjoying being able to do more of a nuanced rating as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars. I can now do 1.75 stars or 2.25 stars or something like that. So in this wrap up, I'm going to give the more nuanced ratings that I've been putting on Storygraph, even though I've been simplifying it on Goodreads. I feel like it gives a more accurate representation of my thoughts because some books that I give 3 stars on Goodreads, they're closer to 4 stars, some are closer to 2 stars. Let's get into the books. I read quite a few mysteries this month, but the first one is my only one that I actually ended up DNFing, A Few Right-Thinking Men, which is the first book of the Ronald Sinclair series by Hilary Gentile. So this series is set in the 1930s in Australia. It follows Ronald Sinclair. He is an artist that is living, I believe, in Sydney, so it's the capital of Australia. Sinclair, the main character, he is living with... Well, he's wealthy, and he has this house that he owns because he's from a very wealthy family, and so he has his artist friends that come and live there with him, pretty much mooching off him. His uncle is also a very wealthy man, and he is found murdered, beaten up by some unknown assailant. And so that's the murder mystery, kind of, but mainly it's about this conflict between the pro-communist and the anti-communist. The anti-communists are afraid that Australia is going to turn into essentially what the Soviet Union is, so they're very afraid of communist proponents taking over the Australian government. So you have those two sides, which in theory is a very interesting concept because you had that same story playing out around the world. You had it in China also, Chiang Kai-shek in China versus Mao Zedong, and of course Mao Zedong won. So you have these debates going on around the world at the time. So it's a very interesting concept to talk about, but I ended up DNFing this book halfway through, and I gave it 0.75 stars. This is one of the lowest ratings I could have given it. And mainly it was because, one, it's not really a mystery. Halfway through, besides his uncle actually being murdered, we have no clues, no persons of interest, no advancements to the mystery. So on the mystery front, it did nothing. But also the way that both the communists and the anti-communists are characterized just feels like complete caricatures. Like they make all the anti-communists these crazy fear-mongering proponents that have no rationality. And the communists are all these great people that are trying to help the future of the world and to help give workers more rights. And the problem with that is no ideology has like completely sane individuals in it. There's crazies in every group. So what I hated in this book is it didn't show any nuance of the political climate in Australia during that time, and instead it just pushed us forward on this path of like the right-thinking men, those that are anti-communist, are completely crazy, and all the communists are great, wonderful, saintly individuals, and I really disliked that. Maybe it got better in the second half, but I ended up DNFing this because there was no mystery. And also, people kept telling Ronald Sinclair that these artists that you're living with are mooching off of you. And he was like, no. But honestly, it felt like that. They were very pointless characters. He has this female love interest that he's been in love with since college, but she's constantly bringing new guys around, and like she doesn't care about you, dude. Like he is so deep in the friend zone, it's painful to watch her take advantage, literally live off him, live in his house. Yeah, I'm gonna take this one order to paint this one thing and I'll make a little bit of money, but it's not enough that I'll actually move out from you because, you know, why would I move out from a great place where I'm mooching off of my friend when I could like live in this cushy house? I'm sorry. I could rant about that book a lot longer, but I will not. The point is, I did not like this book, and I will not be continuing on in the series, obviously. Now we're going to the first book that I actually pulled out of my jar of books I own that I wanted to read, and that is Soul Mountain by Gao Xingjian. I ended up giving this book 1.75 stars, so just under 2 stars. Going into this book, I was expecting it to be much more of an autobiography. So the back presented it as a story of this man, Gao himself, who finds out he has cancer, and only to find out that he doesn't have cancer. And so for a while he was just living like, yeah, I'm going to die any second, and now he's going to live a lot longer. But also because of some of his writing, he's not popular in the Communist Party of China, and I believe this takes place mostly in the 80s. And so he decides to travel across China to live in the wilderness, small villages to survive. And that part of it was absolutely fabulous. I love the elements of him traveling through China, meeting all these different people, learning all these different traditions and different cultural differences compared to like living in Beijing. However, I would say that's about 1/4 of this book, which is not what I was expecting. This book is told in multiple tenses. There are certain sections that are almost dream-like sequences, complete fiction, that are told in the second tense. So, for example, you look out across the valley and you see this beautiful woman. Something I... and I'll get to beautiful woman in a minute. And it was very disconcerting to read second tense. I don't like the you did this. It just feels weird to me unless it's like a choose your own adventure type book. There are also parts where it goes into third person. So there's a lot of like weird experimentation about this book that I really didn't like. And that was one of the main reasons I didn't like this book. But also the other main reason is, at first I thought it was Gao, but now I believe it's the fictional character that he created that is the you perspective. He objectifies women ridiculously. Like, every single woman he meets, he's constantly giving commentary on her bust size and like her physical looks. It really rubbed me wrong. He has an affair for a while with this one girl whose husband beat her. So he makes it seem like he's such this great man because he's, sleeping with her. He's not going to actually stay with her or love her. No, but like at least he's not beating her. And I really hated the treatment of women in this book. But Gao Xingjian is a fascinating man. I mean, he wrote in China, and because of his writing, he had to escape to France, I believe, which is where he actually published this book. So very, very sad life that he had to leave his country just for writing. I told you I got into like a bunch of cozy mysteries this month, and this is the next one, and that is Ghost of a Chance by Kate Dean. This is the first book of the Maggie Mulgrew series. It follows this woman, Maggie, who is an American, but her aunt or great aunt, I think it's aunt, dies and leaves her this antique shop. So she comes over from America to England where the shop is, and she lives there and runs the shop. And I love that setting because I just love like little shops in little towns in England, and I just think it's a great setting for mysteries. And so she goes through to this auction of new antiques, and at the auction, there's several men that are trying to get this certain artifact that ends up was stolen from this professor. The professor comes to look at it, and he meets her, and they go to the person who actually bought the item to find out that he was murdered, and a murder mystery ensues. So the premise was really interesting to me, but I ended up giving this book 2 stars, and the main reason I felt was that it's not a good mystery, and there's way too much focus put on this like very forced romance between the professor that had this item stolen from him and Maggie, the main character. I just really didn't like the romance elements. When it came to the mystery, my main problem that I had is there were pretty much only 3 suspects the entire book, and the problem with doing that in a mystery is that makes it pretty obvious who the murderer is, especially if certain of the suspects are super suspicious. Then you're like, oh yeah, it can't be them. In fact, the first scene that the murderer shows up, before the murder even takes place, I was like, this is the person, which is bad. And there's also this like ghost element, as you can probably tell by the cover. There's this ghost element that is mentioned like twice throughout the entire book, and then at the end of the book it comes up again like, this is important. I'm like, wait, couldn't you have weaved that into the plot at all? The next one is Next Year in Havana by Chanel Clayton. So this book follows two different periods. One is in the 1950s. Elisa is this daughter of a very wealthy Cuban family, and this is at the time where Fidel Castro was fighting with Batista, the dictator of Cuba at the time, to gain control of the government. So Elisa meets this revolutionary who worked with Fidel Castro in trying to overthrow the dictatorship government. As we know, that does not go well for Cuba because Fidel is pretty much just as bad, if not worse, than the other dictator, and millions die in Cuba because either starvation or execution. So it's not a great time to be in Cuba. But in the modern day, Marcel, who is this writer, she wants to take her grandmother, Elisa's ashes, back to Cuba. She's never been to Cuba. Her family ran out of Cuba when Elisa was younger. And she wants to return, Marisol wants to return to Cuba. And there she meets a young man who is the grandson of her grandmother's best friend. And so I would say it's a romance, but it's also more of a historical drama. So I gave this 2.75 stars. I loved the elements where it came to surviving and understanding how the political and economic climate changed in Cuba from the 50s to the modern day, what it was like to live through that, and what it's like to still live in Cuba, and that difference between the tourists that come into Cuba now and those who actually live in Cuba, like what their economic differences are. It is just crazy to read about. That part was really great. I did not like either of the romances in this book. With Marisol in the modern day, she meets this guy, and after 2 weeks or less, I don't remember, it was around 2 weeks, she's absolutely in love with him. And I'm like, girlfriend, you've known him for 2 weeks, okay? Just chill. And with Elisa, again, it seems a little bit like that, where it's like love at first sight, and then she doesn't make any rational decisions when it comes to him. She's slightly better, but I just didn't care about their romance, whereas Marisol's romance I really didn't like. So, the romance was bad, but the historical setting and how that climate was examined was really great. The next book I read for my book club, and that is The Cabinets of Barnaby, Mayne by Elsa Hart. Another cozy historical mystery. This is set in the 1700s, early 1700s, I believe, and it is in London. It's about this man, Barnaby Mayne, who is a collector of everything, and his house is filled to the brim with both historical items, both geological items. For example, he has a room entirely devoted to like rocks from around the world, different types of rocks. And this woman who is married to this man who is at the consulate in some other country, I don't remember where, Cicely Kay, she is very interested in botany. And so she goes to tour this house with a group of other people that are either experts or they're just interested in different things to tour this Barnaby Mayne's massive house. Long story short, Barnaby Mayne is murdered. I ended up giving this 3 stars. The mystery was okay. I didn't hate it. I didn't really love it. My main problem with this book is that it is set in the 1700s, the early 1700s, which to me is not that common when it comes to being written about. With most cozy historical mysteries, most of them are set during the Victorian era or post-Victorian era. I really was excited to read this book because it is set in the 1700s. However, it did not feel as if it was set in the 1700s. It felt much too modern for the era. And for me, that really made me disconnected from the narrative because I could never take seriously the era in which it was set. So there were a few references to things that were going on in history during that time, but outside of that, I could have put this in the 1890s with zero difference to anything. It was a good book. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't Great. Clearly I was preparing for Halloween with the next one because I read The Beast of London, which is the first book of the Mina Murray series by L.D. Goffigan. So this book is a retelling of Dracula. The problem is outside of the similar names. For example, the main girl is named Mina, of course. The main guy is Van Helsing. Outside of that, there is, and the fact that there are vampires, there's no semblance to Dracula. So it starts with Mina. She's engaged to Jonathan Harker, and she is the daughter of this famous scientist researcher. I'm not sure what he was, but he and his assistant, Van Helsing, and her traveled to Transylvania to do research, and her father ended up getting killed. And since then, she is kind of pulled away. She hasn't talked to Van Helsing. They were engaged, but now she doesn't talk to him. And she wants to live an ordinary life with Jonathan Harker. Then Van Helsing shows up back into her life and is like, yeah, vampires are coming and like attacking people, and all these women that were killed with Jack the Ripper, they were actually vampire victims. And she's like, leave me alone. And then, of course, the next night, her fiance, Jonathan Harker, is kidnapped by vampires, and so she has to team up with Van Helsing to rescue him. That's basically the first book. It definitely ends on like a very random point. I felt like we were just traveling along and then we just stopped. But my main issue with this book is that it is related to Dracula, and I feel like it would have been so much better if it had no association with Dracula, because then I'd be like, oh, this is just a fun vampire book. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. I won't be continuing on in the series because I didn't love the first book that much. I actually finished the High Society Lady Detective series. I read both Old Money Murder in Mayfield as well as Murder on a Midnight Clear. The Old Money in Mayfair, I gave 4.25 stars. I really loved it. It's probably my favorite one up to this point. It was very fun, and I really love the romance between the main character, Olive, and Jasper, and how they like solve murders together. So it's a really good murder too, that one particularly. In the next book, I gave 3 stars, The Murder in the Midnight Clear. I really disliked it. So it starts off, she's had this on and off again thing with Jasper, and in the previous book, they actually said, yeah, we like each other. Let's start dating in the sense of like 1930s dating, courting, I suppose. And then what does Olive do? She starts getting suspicious of Jasper and following him everywhere. Like massive stalker moves. She follows him out to the country to this house. And then, of course, a murder happens. And he's completely fine with her being there, like have followed him there. And I'm like, you could have had a setup where she ended up there, but to have her turn into a level 1 stalker, I absolutely hated. The mystery also was fun, but it also had this element of like spy and espionage that randomly came in but did not affect the mystery at all, so that really wasn't necessary. So I didn't love this book as much as the previous books, but it was still good. So the next book has a very long title. Small Boats and Daring Men is what I'm going to call it, but the subtitle is Maritime Raiding, Irregular Warfare, and Early American Navy by Benjamin F. Armstrong. This is a book that I was required to read in my military history class. It pretty much documents these small Navy missions. It starts following the Revolution, and then it goes all the way until the Sumatra Wars. It goes all the way until maybe the 1830s. This book was really interesting. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. It's very dense and hard to read. In that sense, this was a hard book to get through, but it was also really interesting to see like different types of raiding. Like you had the first invented like torpedoes, which are pretty much just mines. So there was a lot of interesting nonfiction history stuff in here. If you are a military history buff, you would probably love this book. But for me, like it was okay, but it wasn't amazing. 3.5 stars is still good. I enjoyed reading this. All right, so the next one I finished just a few days ago, and that is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. I read this book again because my military history teacher was talking about the Civil War, and he gave us a bunch of movies to watch, and he said, if you have not read the Red Badge of Courage, there is not only a movie for it, but there's also a book, and you should read it. And I ended up already owning a copy, and I just haven't read it. It's under 200 pages. It's like 160 pages, so I was like, yeah, I can read that quick this month. That's fine. And I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. Again, it was interesting because of how it depicts war during the Civil War. It follows this young, boy, but he's a young man. I would estimate his age to be somewhere like 16 or 17, but he feels very young. And he joins the Civil War on the Union side, and he ends up running away from his first battle. And in order to prove his courage, mostly to himself, he wants to get wounded, to have that red badge of courage. And that's what the Red Badge of Courage stands for. So it's all about his experiences in war. And in that sense, this book depicts war during this time absolutely perfectly. You see all these different soldiers with these different feelings about war, as well as just how everything is thrown out in the moment of fighting, the fog of war, as the old phrase says. So it was really interesting to read this, but then again, I gave it 3.5 stars. I didn't love it just because I myself don't love reading about war. All right, now we come to the second book that I read for my book club this month, and that is Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell. This book follows this woman whose daughter vanished when she was a teenager, and the mother since then has gone through major grief. Her family's kind of fallen apart. She meets this man who has a daughter who looks exactly like her missing daughter, or almost exactly like. And so it's a mystery thriller. I will say, this is not that much of a mystery. So you find out relatively quickly kind of what happened. It is more of a psychological examination of what these things do to people. So the mother, a lot of people I feel like will dislike the mother, the main character, but I didn't hate her. She was a little bit annoying at times, but I also understood that she let her grief consume her, and she never came out of that grief enough to become happy and care for her family anymore. And you also feel incredibly bad for everyone around the situation, because there is really only one person that is to blame for any of this. And yet everyone has to live with that crime that happened. Don't go into this book expecting like an amazing mystery with all these twists. Go into it thinking it's more of a psychological suspense. I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 3.75 stars. The next one I finished this month, I started last month, is The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. This is the first book of the Wheel of Time series. I gave this 4 stars. I talked a little bit about it in my previous month wrap-up because I was halfway done with it. It was actually the book I was supposed to finish last month, but I didn't. But I finished it at the beginning of this month, so it's fine. This book is also quite long. It's like 800 pages in the copy I own. There's this new darkness rising. You have these witches that are trying to protect the world. You have these 3 young boys that are being sought by this dark lord. And the 3 boys are mostly the main characters. And you also have this young girl from their village, but their village is attacked and they have to escape with this group or fellowship. I compared it last month to Lord of the Rings, and it did really feel like that, but it's a fun book. I don't see myself like running to finish this series quickly, but I definitely want to work my way through this entire series eventually. But it's probably going to take me a while because it's 20-some books. And if they are as long as this one, it's going to take me a long time to get through them, especially since I don't read much, like, very long fantasy. So the next book is Musui's Story, an autobiography of a Tokugawa samurai by Katsu Kokichi. My Japanese is not that great. This is another book I'm reading for one of my classes this semester. It's a very easy book to read. It's pretty big writing, but it is an autobiography that was written during the mid-19th century. I believe he wrote this book in 1840 something. I won't get into all the history that I'm learning about the Edo or Tokugawa period in my class, but basically it was a very strict world where you had the samurai class on top, you had the shogun who dominated Japan, and then you had all the daimyo or the lords, the vassals that they put in charge of fiefs underneath them, and then you had all the rest of the samurai in various cases below them. And Musui was this bakufu samurai, which means the bakufu was the fief or the han of the actual shogun. So he was pretty high up there, and this is basically a story of how not to be a samurai. And to be a samurai is to kind of follow the ideas of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, as well as learn how to use a sword. Of course, during this time, samurai were actually forbidden to use their swords. Basically, he's an idiot. He gets himself into all this trouble, but he wrote this autobiography at the end of his life, pretty much saying to all the young samurai, do not do this, do not do what I did. And then this is what I did. And that's what the entire book is about. It's a very short, quick book to read. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. He is a horrible human being. He goes to prostitutes. He's treating his family horribly. He runs away twice in his life. It's horrible. But you know what? It is very amusing to read. Now we are going to the last book, which is the other one I pulled out of this thing for last month, and that is The Making of Wisconsin by Carrie Smith. This book, I feel like, has fallen apart even worse since I read it. I tried to read it very carefully, but I discovered that there are quite a few pages missing from this. The first chapter almost entirely is missing, as well as a couple pages in the center. A lot of the pages are like partially ripped and have so many like folds and creases, and oh my gosh, it was so hard to read this. But I ended up giving it 4.75 stars, which tells you, yeah, how much I loved it despite all those issues. It was interesting talking to my mom. She said that she grew up in Minnesota and she read this series of books, but for the Minnesota. So it was really cool to like read something that my mom read the same series of like 50 years ago. I have no tie to Wisconsin. I just picked this up at a thrift store for like $2 because it was cheap and I love old books. I figured out, I believe that this was published in 1908, this copy, and it was used in schools. I mean, up till the 60s, obviously, because that's when my mother was going to school. It's a really good book because instead of just giving this very dry history for like high school students, because that would be who would be usually reading this. Instead of giving a really dry history, it gives all these stories about different people, and it feels very much of a like narrative history. It's really fascinating, and even though I don't really care that much about Wisconsin, I have driven through Wisconsin, but I don't know much about it, I really loved reading this book, and I just feel bad like how bad of condition the book is in. I feel like it's going to fall apart any second, so I'm hopefully going to like put that on my shelf and let it like stay safe forever. So not only did I finish the 2 books that I pulled out of here, but I read 2 more books, The Red Badge of Courage and The Next Year in Havana. So I'm like 2 books ahead, which is great. And by the way, if I like read a book and like pull one out of here that I've already read, I'm just going to dispose of the like little card. Now we are going to get into the books that I am going to be reading for next month. So because it is October, I'm going to draw 2 books from here, but I do want to read quite a few like mysteries that I own on my shelves, as well as like mysteries that I don't own. I have a few actually I have already taken out from the library that I'm really excited to get to, so I'm going to get to all the books. Well, first I'm going to get to the books that I absolutely will get to, and then I'll get to the books I'm hoping to get to, but if I don't, it's not the end of the world. So the first book I'm hoping to read is for my book club. I already DNF'd the other book that we're going to read, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the second book is Some Choose Darkness by Charlie Donlia. It follows this woman. She is trying to connect more crimes to this man who is getting out of prison now. In the 1970s, there was this serial killer who killed a bunch of women, and he was caught, and thrown into prison and has been in prison for 40 years, but they could only pin one of the murders on him. So now he is getting out. And Rory is determined to tie all the other murders to him. Of course, there's also that hint of maybe he isn't the killer. Maybe it is someone else. So I'm really interested in reading it. It looks like a fun thriller. The next 2 books I'm going to draw out of here. I'm hoping I get some fun mysteries. I have quite a few mysteries I know. Come on, give me a mystery. Well, the first book I have is The Pharaohs of Ancient Egypt by Elizabeth Payne. I bought this book from Book Outlet a few years ago, and I like learning about pharaohs of Egypt. But on one hand, this will be very quick to read. On the other hand, I was not hoping for this to be reading for Halloween, though I guess mummies goes with Halloween. So all right, so that's the first book. Oh, actually, the next one I pulled, oddly enough, is Next Year in Havana, which I just read this month. So we're gonna pull another one because it doesn't count. So I'm just gonna toss this one. Okay, well, again, not one I would read for Halloween, but okay. And that book is Unbroken by Laura Hildebrand. This is a nonfiction following this runner, sprinter, Olympic champion who goes into World War II and gets captured by Japan and tortured for a while. I've seen parts of the movie. I haven't read it all the way through. Definitely not great for Halloween, but yeah, oh well. I mean, I have been wanting to read this book for a long time, so there's that. So those are the 3 books for sure that I'm going to read next month. Now I have a few books that I am just going to talk about. For example, I ordered Busman's Honeymoon from the library. I've been borrowing this book from my sister for 2-3 years, and I have yet to read it. And now that my sister is getting married in 2 weeks and moving out, I want to get her this book back so that she can move out with it and I don't have to go give it to her eventually. So I have 2 Goosebumps actually I'm hoping to read. The first one is Welcome to Dead House, and the second one is Welcome to Camp Nightmare. Both of these I remember reading as a child, which is why I picked them out. They're pretty quick and liked to get through. I really loved Goosebumps as a child, but I have not read Goosebumps for over a decade. And then I also found this book, which Jules Verne is one of my favorite authors, and he wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's my favorite one. Journey to the Center of the Earth, The Mysterious Island. He wrote all that. I found this book by him. It's called A Castle in Transylvania by Jules Verne. I have no idea what it's about, but it's about vampires. And I had no idea that Jules Verne ever wrote about vampires, so I was like, yes, I'm going to pick this up. I also have this book, which is a YA, so I'm not sure. I have been kind of anti-YA recently. All the YA books I've read I haven't enjoyed, but this is Blood Countess by Lana Popovic. Elizabeth Bathory was this woman in the 1500s who would... rumors say she murdered women, took their blood, and then bathed in their blood. She's the female equivalent to the origin of Dracula. But so this book follows this young woman who goes to be a maid at Elizabeth Bathory's place. And so it's kind of horror. It looked really good, especially I was in the mood for horror and Halloween, and I was like, yes, I want to read this. So those are the books that I'm hoping to get done, but if I don't get it done, it's not the end of the world. So those are all the books I read this month and am hoping to read next month. Have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked, subscribe. I post every Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!